Creative Babble.
Many of us are curious about where we came from. I know I thought I knew about my own ancestry and family history, and I was completely wrong. In fact, most of my family is from Portugal. I didn't know that. And nowadays, it's just so easy. You can just spit in a vial, put it in the mail, and in a couple weeks, this fancy app tells you everything you want to know about your DNA and your family history. David Barry, who you're going to hear from in just a second, was just as curious about his past.
So my last name is Barry. It's not a super uncommon name. My father grew up without really knowing his own father. He passed away, I think, when my father was 6 years old. And even prior to that, didn't have much of a relationship with him. I was like, you know what? I'm going to find out where Barry comes from. And I ordered the Ancestry.com DNA tests on those Christmas specials that they're always running.
So he got one of the tests.
And I spit in the vial, I filled it up.
And then he sent it in.
Didn't really think much of it.
A few weeks go by.
And so I went into Ancestry.com and logged in, and my results were there. And I was like, oh, okay.
But as he was going through the results,
some things just didn't really add up. The first part was that I was apparently 56% European Jewish. And then the other half of me was a mix of German and Dutch and, scant parts of other things.
The reason why this didn't make any sense was because David thought he was Italian.
But I did know that my grandmother was Italian and was, I believe, she had either been born there or her parents had been born in Italy. So Italian definitely should have been there. Maybe my grandmother was born in Italy, but she wasn't Italian. Maybe the family came from somewhere else or whatever.
All right. So these weren't the results he was expecting, but in a way, he was rationalizing it, trying to explain it away. But then David got a match from a woman that he didn't know. And according to Ancestry.com, they were close enough to be first cousins, an aunt, or even a half-sibling.
And, immediately I'm like, well, I'm sure she's not my half-sister. I'm sure she's not my aunt. I would probably know that. Maybe she's a first cousin. So I messaged her saying, hey, we're a very close, DNA match. What do you know about your origins? And she said, in truth, I don't. I know that I was conceived through a sperm donor. I speak to my parents about it, and they're aware in the early going that this is something I've found. But they, very politely were like, look, if this is a possibility, I don't think it's a rabbit's hole we should be going down and poking around. Like, I would prefer that you kind of, left it there. And I was like, well, okay. So, but curiosity is always going to get the better of me.
So he started writing this woman letters, trying to put the pieces together. And then he got a sign that he couldn't ignore. You see, David's wife is adopted.
And she has a sister who's also adopted.
Follow me here for a second, but his wife's sister came into town to visit because she had some big news.
And came over to tell my wife that she had found her biological half-sister and her biological father through an Ancestry.com DNA test. And so she's telling us, how she put the pieces together and said, this girl and I have X amount of centimorgans in common, which is a measure of shared DNA with somebody else. And those ranges put you in different potential categories of connections. So, 500 would make you, maybe a second or third cousin. She had shared 1,100 centimorgans with this girl who she ultimately learned was her half sister. And immediately my mind starts spinning because I'm like, wait a second.
According to Ancestry.com, David had an even stronger connection to this person who he was connected to on Ancestry than his wife's sister had to this newly discovered family member that she found.
They had 1,100 centimorgans in common, but I had 1,500 with this girl that I had, matched with, if you will, on Ancestry.com.
That's interesting.
It was a little more than interesting because at that point I knew I was very sure that someone was withholding something from me. I just didn't know what. I guess it was obvious what. It was becoming eerily clear that I was a half sibling of this woman. I just didn't know how, and I wasn't sure whose life I was going to blow up in figuring it out.
Remember, his parents asked him to stop looking into this, but he couldn't help it. He was in way too deep.
So this girl and we found an additional third-party website where you could upload your raw data from any third-party DNA site, and it would tell you if you shared maternal or paternal DNA, and then it would give you a breakdown of between the 23 chromosomes, in your own strand, which ones do you share common traits with somebody else. But we do remember very clearly that there was a third match, and we did a little sleuthing and realized that all three of us were born in Rochester, New York, within 11 months of each other. And I immediately knew that whatever growing suspicions I had, there was something there that I wasn't being told. I told my parents again, that night what I had uncovered, and I even gave them an opportunity. I'm like, look, I believe I'm not being told something, and I'm not accusing anybody of anything, but this is the information that I have. And we went to bed that night, and the next night my father texted me as I was leaving my boxing gym, and he asked if I was home and if I could talk. I knew something was up, and I got in the car and I called him and I said, what's going on? And he said, I know you've been really looking into this DNA stuff for, information about, my father, but you're not going to find it. And he told me, you're not my biological son.
His father explained that they were trying to start a family, but they were having a lot of trouble.
Well, the part that they left out was that in order to actually start a family, they had to seek the help of a sperm donor.
On today's episode, we're going to talk about one man who's responsible for fathering God knows how many people. David Barry is going to put on his detective hat and try to find all his half-siblings to piece together the mystery of their lives. I'm Javier Leiva, and this is Pretend, stories about real people pretending to be someone else.
It made all the sense in the world for these pieces I was trying to fill in. It was as earth-shattering a discovery as you could make.
Right. That's the equivalent, I would imagine, of finding out you're adopted, or
right.
That kind of revelation could be pretty traumatic, I would imagine.
It was. So I, was raised with a younger sister who's just about 6 years younger than me, and she and I are very, very close. And one of the first thoughts that I was like, all right, well, if they used a sperm donor for me, there's probably no doubt that they used one for her, and they confirmed that was the case. So it was also going to be a revelation to her. And there was also the question of whether or not she and I were from the same donor. And to this day, we don't know that answer. My sister, has opted not to go down this rabbit hole that I accidentally went down. I know who my father is, and it's a man who raised me and loved me. I
can't even imagine everything that's going through your head, but you're not going to stop your investigation now. So I met all these people who share the same DNA as I do, or are biologically connected to me. And they're all from Rochester. But I mean, I'm trying to put myself in your shoes, and I would probably jump to the conclusion that, well, maybe there's a guy who donates a lot, in the Rochester area.
Yeah. What immediately crossed my mind was more or less that. I'm like, okay, there's three within 11 months. It seemed feasible. All of our parents were told is that the donors that we were the products of would have been resident physicians at the University of Rochester. Odds are that was, our biological father. So I'm thinking, all right, well, for a couple, 2 to 3, sometimes 4 years, physicians are in residency. So yeah, I could see that it would be feasible that a student would donate over the course of a year. Again, you're using Occam's razor, right? Like the simplest path to the explanation is the one that makes the most sense, or at least I thought I was. And then, things started to spin out of control about a year later. So I had to be in New York City, where one of my half siblings lives. It felt like I was asking a girl out on a first date almost. I was like, hey, I'm going to be here. Like, I don't know how you feel about all this, but would you want to like meet up for a drink or something? And he said, yeah. And then our half sister was like, wait, if you guys are both going to be there, then like, why don't I meet you there too? And so 2 weeks after this discovery, the three of us met each other in person in New York.
I'm sure you've been asked this question, but it's a personal curiosity. Like, do you see similarities, like physical similarities between your siblings?
Yeah. I mean, some more than others, but I remember when I met Morgan, so funny enough, and she was the first one, I ever saw in person, and we hugged, like movie scene hug, everything, like just, so great to meet her. And she, steps back, I'm still like, we're still holding each other. And she like immediately starts like grabbing my face. And she's like, your face is on my face. Like it was that she and I look a lot alike. And then, we immediately flew to New York there, and our half brother, we knew where he lived. So we were walking up, the street, kind of like, looking to find the address. But then there was a guy standing on, or rather sitting on, some front steps of a building, and, stands up and turns toward us. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like, I have light eyes and crow's feet, around those smile, marks. And he immediately like had all of those things, the same jawline. I was just like, oh my gosh. It was disorienting to meet my half sister, but it was really disorienting to meet him, because he and I are, 10 months apart, built, same height, same features. Like we're very clearly brothers.
That's crazy.
And that is really wild.
Both of David's half-siblings already knew that they were conceived through a sperm donor, so that was not news to them.
As it turns out, that all three of our mothers, after asking my parents, went to the same fertility doctor. Again, not a huge surprise, given Rochester not being a huge city. And then almost exactly a year later, funny enough, the night before, we had gotten all three of our families to meet together in person in Rochester, New York. It was just incredible. One of the most, still to this day, one of the happiest nights of my entire life. And the next morning, I wake up to a text message from our half brother saying, there's another one. He had matched with a woman on 23andMe and did some quick sleuthing, saw same Rochester, New York, within 11 months to a year of us. And it became clear all like very quickly that there was something not as sweet and, romantic, if you will, about our story. Now there's 5 of us in the same city.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. There's 5,
yeah,
right?
born within a year of each other. Like there's something not right going on.
I mean, just stop and think about this for a second. All these siblings are growing up in the same area of Rochester. I mean, it's possible that they could become friends, possibly form relationships and get married. I mean, But the numbers continued to rack up over the next 18 months. By then, there was another half brother who turned out to be a middle school classmate of mine. And then a few months after that, another half brother who thankfully none of us had any previous connections to. And so I think there were 9 or 10 at this point. 9 or 10 siblings that he knew of. But David didn't want to just stop here.
I'm going to figure this out. Like I don't want this as an unanswered question in my life. So I was thankfully connected to a team called DNA Angels. And in this world, I've learned a lot about, being donor conceived. They are like DNA detectives.
They take DNA and examine it a little bit closer, try to figure out places of birth, ports of entry, that kind of thing.
After, 10 or so half siblings, we discovered that all of our mothers had gone to the same fertility doctor.
The doctor in question here is Dr. Morris Wortman, who operates an OBGYN office in Rochester, New York.
It was a suspicion. I couldn't, prove it or anything like that. And they said, look, we can confirm that 5 generations ago on your paternal side, you have a biological connection to him. There would be no way to confirm it unless you got someone who was, like a first generation of his to take a DNA test. As it happens, he has, 3 known daughters that he's raised. And they had, pulled up the contact information for one of them and said, if you can get her, her to agree to take a DNA test, then, that's going to be your path to an answer. Meaning if she were to take a DNA test, which was a huge leap, and we were to come back as a match for half siblings, then that would confirm, what we believed, that our biological father was the fertility doctor. And I make a call, and I'm expecting look, when I get a phone call from a number I don't know, I immediately send it to voicemail.
Right.
And if I, hear a voice message and it's like, a little out there or not interesting, like I'm not even that good at responding. So that's what I was prepared for. I was going to leave a voice message. Instead, she picked up.
David Barry explained who he was and why he was calling, and he told her that he has evidence to prove that they might be related.
And she agreed to take a DNA test.
That's incredible, because you're coming out of nowhere, accusing her father. It would have put me in a defensive position. So
right.
It was incredible that she actually went along with this.
It was. Well, and as it turns out, she had discovered, my blog the following day and, doubled down. She's like, look, if this is true, what you're suspecting, then like you deserve to know. And I want to know too.
So when the results came in, David and Dr. Morton's sister hopped on a video conference call so that they could see the results together. When we come back, David is going to find out conclusively if Dr. Wortman is his father or not. David had reached out to one of Dr. Wortman's daughters to see if she would be willing to give a DNA sample so that they could conclusively know whether Dr. Wortman was in fact the father of all these children.
It was one of those, like high drama movie scenes where you hear the music in the background type of thing. And, I opened the PDF and scrolled down, and we were a 99.99% match as half siblings. And it confirmed that her biological father, our mother's fertility doctor, had fathered all of us. I want to say the quote unquote youngest was born in 87 and the oldest was born in 82. I was born in 84. So I was like right in the middle.
But remember, these are only the siblings who they know of, the ones who have actually taken a DNA test. Most people haven't done an ancestry DNA test, so God knows how many siblings are actually out there.
And that's just very, probable. The second part is the age range that we might discover could be, much greater than what we thought. Yeah.
And to your knowledge, from what you've been able to gather, how many siblings total have you discovered?
I think if you count his known children, children that he raised in his own family, plus the half siblings that we found through commercial DNA tests, I think the number is 15. I think it's 16 now, come to think of it, with one that we just found out a few weeks ago. So yeah, I expect that those numbers will continue to go up. So now you've kind of zeroed in on Dr. Wortman, right? Yep. And you now have tangible evidence that he is your biological father. Where do you go from there? Like, what do you do next? I'm still figuring that out. I have one of the better outcomes. And what I mean by that is I was raised by two parents who've loved me unequivocally my entire life. I have siblings whose parents were already gone by the time that they made this discovery, and they can't ask questions and they can't reconcile some of that. I have siblings who were not raised in loving families. One in particular who was bounced around the foster care system, and some who, have both parents, but don't have great relationships with them. My half sister, the first one that I matched with, was a gynecological patient of Dr. Wortman's under his care for close to 9 years. And there is no doubt in my mind that he knew the entire time. She notified him at their first, appointment that, hey, my mother was, a part of your practice, and you're really revered in our family because you helped, create me. My family's always spoken really highly of you, and, I'm here because of your help with my family. And so immediately in that first, appointment, he's aware of who she is in the context of that relationship. And then as more, revelations come out, like, hey, I found, two half brothers. Hey, there's more of us. The number's up to 9 or 10 or whatever. At this point, there's zero doubt in his mind or my mind that he knew exactly who he was dealing with, that this was, one of his biological children. And, I don't assume that he inseminated all of his patients, but as this was happening, your half sister is telling her gynecologist, which is, Dr. Wortman, that she's going through this discovery process. Correct.
So he's aware of this? Like,
he's aware.
I would imagine that he might be freaking out because at the time when he was donating sperm or impregnating all these women, like he'd never in his wildest dream probably thought that ancestry.com was going to be a thing, right?
Right. And I can't imagine, a lot of people did, right? Like my parents, they had no way of predicting that one day you'd be able to spit, in a vial and send it through the mail and figure this all out too. In the same way, I'm sure he didn't as a physician. At some point, he was unequivocally clear in my mind that he was her biological father, and he continued to provide care to her.
And can you believe it? Dr. Wortman is still practicing today. Well, his troubles aren't over because David's half-sister has filed a civil lawsuit against him in the state of New York.
He violated her and removed her choice to abstain from care from him, knowing full well that he was her biological father. She didn't have that luxury. She didn't know. And a gynecological office is not the place that it's not just checking on I came in for a sinus infection. These are highly invasive personal procedures that she was subjected to, and as it turns out, by her biological father. A lot of people have an interest in this because of how unique it is, but they are floored when they discover that what happened to our mothers and us as the product of it is not illegal in New York State. Progress is being made. I believe as of today, there's only 13 or so states that have passed what's called fertility fraud legislation that would, number one, outlaw this practice, and number two, create measures where there can be, remuneration for people who've been, violated in this way. Legally, he hasn't actually done anything wrong. Now, when fertility fraud legislation is passed in a lot of states, they make these laws retroactive.
David and his sister have worked closely with New York state senators, sharing their stories and trying to see if they could pass fertility fraud legislation in New York.
And we're hopeful, we're optimistic that, a state like New York, which is known for being progressive in, a lot of social issues, would see this as a no-brainer. And frankly, we've talked to both sides of the political aisle, Republicans and Democrats, and this is one of those rare cases, especially now in this political climate, that everybody sees eye to eye on this. They know that this is a no-brainer.
Because as unique as your story may seem to everyone listening to this, actually, there were two other doctors in Rochester accused of doing the same thing, right?
Yes. Yeah. And one of them is on record and being quoted there, not to put words in his mouth, but almost nonchalant about the fact that this was happening. And
I'll read it to you because I thought,
it
actually, I think everybody's first reaction is, this is fraud. How dare he? What was he on a power trip? Was he playing God? But then when you read this quote, you kind of sort of have to step back in time and kind of understand the technology and what was possible and what wasn't. But he says, I was a donor at one time. Sometimes back in those days, before the days of fertility clinics, you couldn't get a hold of a donor and you were working with a patient who was looking to get pregnant. It wasn't exactly ethical, but it wasn't unknown to happen. He added, I assume other doctors did it, but no one ever talked about it. And I think that some of the reasoning was that, prior in the 70s and the 80s, they didn't freeze sperm back then.
No. Yeah.
You needed a fresh sperm donor, right?
Right. And funny enough, that's, that was a story that was told, to our mothers. And then, my mother, she remembered that day that she ended up getting pregnant. She remembers, Dr. Wortman saying, we have a live donor. It'll be a fresh sample. I'm just going to go to the other room to get it. And I feel really confident that this is going to work. And, now we know exactly why he was so confident. He'd already had success and he knew, exactly what he was doing in those cases. And, look, I've asked this question of myself more than anybody, what are the motivations? Everybody tends to want to put, right? I think everyone feels one way or the other. And I've read enough internet comments to know, which is either this is egregious, this guy should, be in prison for the rest of his life. And the other side are, what are you so upset about? You're here and your biological father's a doctor, so you got, you're intelligent or whatever. I think that, I believe in all sincerity that there probably was a care component, that you want your patients to get their outcomes. But wrapped into that, I really do think that ego is a huge part of it. The all powerful knowing I can do this. I can succeed. And oh, by the way, like my progeny are going to be, great because I believe, so much in myself that, what woman wouldn't want my sperm? And I do believe that there's, in the case of ours, in fact, that, Dr. Wortman is the son of Holocaust survivors. And I can't help but ignore, the current state, as I've, read through the news of the role that Judaism plays in his life, for better or worse, that might be a motivator for him in some ways to have, that lineage, whether they're aware that they even have it or not, but to have that be a part of, continuing on a bloodline that lost so many connections, I believe is another part. And the only person who could give you that answer in certainty is him. But I don't believe that answer is, ever coming to the satisfaction of anybody.
Another motivation could be, I have success after success after success. It's like he's showing his business is thriving. It's almost like a monopoly on childbirth.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And it's never, you never arrive at a place where you're happy with the answer. So I've entertained it from a theoretical perspective, but I'm never going to be satisfied with the answer. And that's something that I have to carry.
Part of it is what it is, right? Like this is your reality. This is all your half siblings' reality too. And I mean, I guess a silver lining in this is I would imagine is being able to go from just having one sibling to having a lot of siblings. I bet you guys have like this like crazy connection that nobody could really understand.
Yeah, so that's partly true. And I would say at the same time, it's actually more complicated than that. I would say, in one sense, there's an immediate intimacy with these people because we're all experiencing something that so few people will ever experience. Like I can tell people about it, but they just don't know what what it really feels like. So in that sense, you have a built-in support group in a lot of ways. But the challenges as the numbers rise is you give so much of yourself in an emotional capacity to the new members, if you will. So Morgan and our half brother, the first quote unquote three of us, it was just us for a year, and so our connection grew and deepened based on our assumption at the time that it was just three of us. And then you start to add in others, and then by the time the numbers get to 7 or 8 or 9, it's a lot of an emotional undertaking to try to provide that level of emotional vulnerability to every new person who joins your group. And in that sense, I know I got lucky that I was one of the first 3. And I do sympathize with the half siblings who are, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 or whatever, because, some of us have intentionally or not started to set up boundaries around ourselves on a personal level because we still have to live our own lives. And that I hope it doesn't mean, ever coming across as, rude or rejecting, but I know that it's interpreted that way at times. Unfortunately, I've had conversations like that with some of my half siblings who feel like they've been rejected. And that's hard.
You can't sustain that cyclone of emotions for every time a news have. And I never even, while thinking about the story, I never even anticipated that because I'm thinking, it would be awesome having 9 brothers and sisters, but it's not that simple, I guess. There is, an obvious plus side. Well, maybe not obvious, but there is a plus side, like you do have that connection. No one can undo it. And I think, I've been cordial to every, half sibling that I've met and vice versa. But the relationships are complex. And as I had mentioned, some of them come from environments where, they didn't have siblings or even a good family background to stand on. So they're coming into this hoping to fill a void that may not be reciprocated in the way that they're hoping for. And, that's hard. I to the extent that I can, I sympathize with them. But I also know that at the end of the day, I have, my own family that I need to provide emotional energy for. And it's not easy. That's been one of the unintended, challenges of this is knowing you can't be everything to everybody. And I have one brother and it's hard to, you know what I mean? Like it's hard to keep up, and I can't imagine with 9. Do you have any interest in knowing Dr. Wortman?
No, I have, everything that I could want, and I'm not going to gain more by trying to get, any sort of relationship out of him. Like I have my family and I know who that is. I think by the time the test results came in, on the confirming that Dr. Wortman was my biological father was like a week and a half before my wife gave birth to our son. And like the weird emotions that I felt, like holding him for the first time were just, it was the ultimate moment of everything crashing into you all at once. And I did some real ugly crying that day.
Well, I can't imagine you're holding the future of your genes and your family history. And then you're also looking backwards and discovering, like these two unknowns. That must have been very confusing.
It was, and it's still disorienting, like as much as I want to separate myself from Dr. Wortman, like I can't ignore that a lot of, who I am. And if I have a, decent enough self-image and, living my life happily, I have to recognize that a big part of that is because of him. And, but at the same time, whether I liked it or not, I can't undo it. And his DNA is also in my son, and I can't undo that. And I don't spend a lot of time being introspective about it, but I will think about that for the rest of my life. And, I don't know that I'll ever have a resolution or an explanation that makes me, feel good about it. But I also know that I have no control over it. And it is what it is.
And just so you know, I actually reached out to Dr. Wortman's office, and he has yet to respond to my request for an interview. Just as I was working on this story, I noticed that Netflix just released a documentary on the same topic called Our Father, and it's about the same thing. So I suspect that with the advent of some of these DNA services, that we're going to learn about more cases just like this. I'd love to know what you think of the story. Shoot me an email at javier@pretendradio.org. Also, if you're on TikTok, guess what? So is this guy. Follow me at PretendPod. I'm giving it a shot. I feel super silly doing it, but I'm posting almost every day. So follow me on TikTok. I would love to know what you think. And did I tell you that John Taylor, my co-host from Criminal Conduct, and I are going to be at the True Crime Podcast Festival in Dallas this August? For more information, see the show notes.
Creative Babble.